Hello and welcome back. This is the second half of two videos. The first one is, of course, why did Americans support imperialism? This is going to be why did Americans reject imperialism? Now, when it comes to rejecting imperialism, the forces that reject imperialism are actually going to be more influential at first, and then they're going to gradually lose their influence as the forces that support imperialism become more dominant in political, particularly in the role of President Theodore Roosevelt, who was very imperialistic, but so was President McKinney before him. So don't blame anything on the Roosevelts. All right, why? Why would they reject imperialism? Probably the first and foremost is that the United States was itself a former colony. We were part of the British Empire, eventually what's going to become the largest empire in the world history is going to be the British Empire. British Empire used to brag that the sun never sets on the English Empire because it was true. Every moment of every day, the sun is shining on English territory somewhere. Today, it's not an empire, but it's a commonwealth of nations, and you can still say the sun never sets on the Commonwealth of Nations, and about 1/4 of the global population lives within a former English territory. So that's a pretty big empire. And the United States was very aware of that, and we were very proud of our independence. And it didn't make sense to a lot of people why we would become an imperialist country when we ourselves were the product of people who were escaping that imperialism, that we were trying to escape this idea that some government somewhere over there across the seas is telling us what to do. We wanted self-government. We wanted independence and self-rule. We wanted to make our own laws, make our own culture, make our own decisions. And many people felt that as a nation, that's something we should be promoting. We shouldn't become the thing that we threw away. Instead, we should be promoting and actively assisting countries or territories who were trying to break away from empires. And so the idea of being an empire was just weird and strange and not American to many people. So they rejected the idea of an American empire. Other people saw American imperialism as nothing more than a land grab. In the earliest parts of the 19th century, after we had conquered the United States continent, big chunks of North America, people began looking at Latin America. People were called filibusters, as, you know what, we can go and invade Cuba, and then we can establish slavery in Cuba instead of in the United States. And so some people they still remembered those days, the days of the filibuster, and they had a really negative idea. Well, wait a minute, imperialism is all about spreading ideas and institutions that we did not want in our country, and then are eventually going to be rejected. Other people opposed imperialism for economic reasons. All right, just like there was an economic reason to support imperialism, there's an economic reason to oppose imperialism, and that is that many of the countries that we were talking about going in and occupying, their economies would now be tied to our economy. And so if they had economic problems, and many of them were less developed, they were not industrialized, and they were more subject to the effects of, say, natural disasters, then it would be potential if we took over Hawaii, for example, and Hawaii has a lot of earthquakes, has a lot of volcanoes, and there was a major eruption, the United States would then be on the hook financially to help all those people out. And so it would be possible for the Philippine economy or the Hawaiian economy to drag the American economy down. So, when you're in the same wagon, then you're kind of responsible for each other. And since the United States would be the biggest economy and would be the ones in charge because we were the empire, then it would be our responsibility. And so there was this rejection of that responsibility. And the last thing is there were racist reasons to reject imperialism. Just like there were racist reasons to expand imperialism at the white man's burden, there was also reasons to reject imperialism because most of the countries that we're talking about moving into the Pacific, the people there are of Pacific Islanders or of Asian descent. In other words, they're not white. And so there was a concern, particularly across the South, that if you open up territories to, you establish colonies and territories in non-white parts of the world, that you would be opening the doors for more non-whites to come to our country. And that non-whiteness would somehow dilute our country and weaken our country. Again, this is a racist idea, but there were a number of people who were very opposed to expanding and keeping the Philippines, for example, because they didn't want a bunch of Filipinos who think, well, I don't really like the Philippines, but hey, since we're part of the United States, I'm moving to California. And so there was this balancing act of how we take advantage of that territory without allowing all of these non-white people into our country. And so it becomes so that's a strong argument against imperialism, why many people rejected that imperialist ideas. Again, ultimately, the people who reject imperialism are going to lose the argument. In the other video, I talk about Hawaii. And after Hawaii had their revolution in the early 1890s, the people who opposed imperialism were still dominant in our country. They were still dominant in our political system. And so when Hawaii says, hey, we want to become part of the United States, they were like, nah, we're not really interested in forming an empire. And so, no, we're not going to annex you with this. And no, go away, go form your own country. And so they go and they form the Republic of Hawaii. So Hawaii, like Texas, was a republic for about 10 years. But again, kind of like Texas, what happens is there's a change in government, there's a change in attitudes in Washington, D.C., as the people who support imperialism become more influential than the people who reject imperialism. And so President McKinley and then later President Roosevelt go, you know what, Hawaii's looking pretty good. It's got a great location. And so by the end of the 1890s, the people who are rejecting imperialism are going to basically, they're going to lose that political fight. And the United States will, in fact, establish an empire that stretches from the Philippines all the way to the Caribbean Sea. It's going to be about 1/3. Of course, it's sparsely populated because it's mostly ocean, but it's going to be about 1/3 of the circumference of the Earth. And so we will establish this global empire, and in doing so, we become an empire, a great power or a global power, much like England and France and Russia and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and some of these other empires. And it's also going to thrust us into global affairs. So probably one of the biggest arguments against forming a global empire and rejecting imperialism was that the United States, being protected by two oceans and having neighbors to the north that are pretty nice and aren't going to do anything to us, and neighbors to the south that are fairly weak and aren't going to really be a threat, the United States was in a favored position, and they're going to be able to go and do what they want to do. But by establishing a global empire and embracing imperialism, the United States is now going to be drug into international conflicts. And this is certainly going to be the case. The United States will, in fact, in 1916, be drug into what was, at the time, the largest international conflict in history, that, of course, being the Great War, the war to end all wars, World War I. So, in that argument, the anti-imperialists were right. So, take it for what you will. All right, so have a great day, and I'll talk to you in class.